Well, hello, and Weighed in the Balance, the show where we examine to see if claims can hold up to scrutiny. And today is actually a special edition episode, I guess. We normally release episodes every Tuesday, and so far have all dealt with specifically apologetics issues. But as some of you may be aware, the Presbyterian Church in America recently had our General Assembly in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and some people have had some stuff to say about that. There have been some actually pretty serious claims made, I think, and so I wanted a couple guys who have way better PCA credentials than me to jump on. And so I am joined today by Mr. Ryan Biese, stated clerk of the Tennessee Valley Presbytery, and the aforementioned from a couple episodes ago, fire-breathing postmillennialist who just dropped off, but he'll be joining us later, Nate Xanders. So, Ryan, Nate, I think, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me, and I should say just at the beginning that, yes, I am the clerk of Tennessee Valley Presbytery, but I do not speak for or represent the Presbytery on this program. That's just, the clerk is just a paper pusher. I have no voice to speak for the Presbytery except as the Presbytery gives me words, and so these are my words, not those of the Presbytery. Since you mentioned it, I just want to clarify.
You know, I made that mistake one time with a lawyer one time that I said, hey, I got a lawyer question. And he said, well, just to be clear, I'm not licensed to practice law in this state. So I apparently step on that landmine a lot. At the Presbyterian Church in America's General Assembly, first of all, Ryan, how do you think the assembly went? I thought it went great, but give us your take.
Yeah, I thought it was a very good assembly. Not all the votes went the way that I wanted them to this year, which was a new experience for me. The past couple of years, I think I was on the prevailing side on every vote, every significant vote, which that itself was a new experience for me because the first 5 years of ordained ministry, none of the votes went the way I wanted them to, for the most part at least. So, you know, I think that's just you win some, you lose some, and we are brothers. I was impressed. My biggest disappointment was with Overture 12 and who may distribute the elements of the supper. I was disappointed with the way that vote went, but I was impressed. At least the guys arguing against my position and the position the assembly ultimately took, most of them were arguing from Scripture, or at least wanting to be proved from Scripture why we should make the change that was desired by the guys on my side. So even with the brothers with whom I disagreed, I appreciated that how they were looking to Scripture and demanding that people with my persuasion prove from Scripture why this change is necessary. That's a long answer to your short question. Sorry.
Yeah, but no, I think that actually does illustrate something about Presbyterianism that is very important to keep in mind as we sort of look at what I think is a manufactured controversy, honestly, but the controversy that we're going to address today, which is that you and I both took a vow to submit to our brothers in the Lord. I forget I think that is the vow. Do you promise submission to your brothers in the Lord? And so when we meet for an assembly, whether that is the court of the church at the local level at the session, whether that is the court at the regional level in the presbytery, or whether it is the highest court, the General Assembly, the decisions of the assembly are the decisions of the church, and even if we were not on the winning side, we still abide by what our brothers have said. Now, there are ways that you can bring complaints, and there are different actions that can be taken. I remember when I was just coming into the PCA, the revoice stuff, which actually the guys on this podcast mentioned, that was in like full swing at the first General Assembly that I ever attended, which was 2021. And that was the year of the so-called revoice overtures, which passed at the assembly and then failed at the presbytery level. But that was not a failure of the church. That was the church working through things, coming to better understandings. There were people who opposed those particular overtures, not because of what they were trying to do, but because of the particular wording that they used. And so we had to come to a place where we could all, as brothers, live together and work together in the same denomination. So I thought that the assembly as a whole went great. I lost 2 votes that I was very disappointed that I lost. One was Overture 9, which would have restructured our administrative committee. And there was some guy that got up and spoke against it that really, Ryan, that was you. You and I were on different sides of that, but I felt bad for your groomsmen in your wedding, but I was disappointed to lose that vote. I was disappointed over the distribution of the Lord's Supper, but even on that one, we established a committee to bring us recommendations for a constitutional directory of worship. And so you never want to take one assembly as the be all end all of the church. Everything is, it's a process that is still ongoing as Christ builds his church. But I see a fire-breathing postmillennialist.
Oh boy, my technical
Do I hear
difficulties.
a fire-breathing postmillennialist?
Yeah, my technical difficulties have prohibited me from being here on time. I apologize, guys, but I just downloaded the app instead of trying to go through Google Chrome, and it seems to have temporarily resolved the problem. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, I'm sorry we had to jump on without you, but before we get into the actual thing that we're going to be addressing, you guys both have podcasts that are more popular than mine. So, Ryan, what is your podcast? And shamelessly self-promote.
My podcast is the Westminster Standard. We are allegedly on a short break for the month of July, but we'll have another episode out soon enough. We mostly focus on PCA issues, though we do discuss news and events in other denominations in the NAPARC world and sometimes beyond. We did an episode on the EPC and the Christian Reformed Church. So we're slowly looking at other denominations and just trying to discuss matters that are being discussed in the Reformed world, broadly speaking.
And Nate, what is your podcast that is better than this one?
Yeah, well, I don't know if it's better than yours, actually. I'm not fit to make that judgment. But it's really not my podcast as much as it is the podcast arm of reformingmen.com, which started out as a blog. And then eventually we decided to also have a podcast extension of our labors there. And so we've got 4 other guys that labor either in the blog capacity or in the podcast. So I hesitate to say it's mine. It's something that I'm blessed to be a part of. But yeah, check us out, reformingmen.com, and we'll have some special episodes coming out later this summer for our supporting listeners, and then eventually we'll roll those out to everybody else probably later in the fall.
Great. Yeah, having both of you guys on is a little awkward for me to be the host because you all are much more experienced at hosting than I am, but we'll soldier on. So Doug Wilson has, he's had some stuff to say about one particular encounter that happened at the PCA. There is, every year we have certain positions that get reelected every year. One is the stated clerk, for example, which right now we are without a permanent stated clerk because Dr. Brian Chappell retired, and next year we'll have a recommendation for someone to actually take that job. We have ruling elder John Biese sort of acting in a temporary capacity, but the director of Mission to the World is reelected every year. Probably Geneva Benefits, maybe, I think.
Well, no, I think it's MTW, M&A, CDM, and the stated clerk are reelected every year. And
yes.
Importantly, not to correct you, but to correct you, they're not directors. They're just coordinators.
Thank you.
That's an important matter of history. A number of years ago, the coordinator of MTW wanted to be called the president of MTW because when he goes to these conferences with Baptists and other big things, he doesn't have an analogous title. But the assembly at that point reminded him that no, this is a committee and you're just a coordinator, and that's by design. So the directors are actually subordinate to the coordinators, which is interesting. Curiosity of Presbyterian polity.
Yes, but that does reflect a quirk of us that we never want to vest one guy with the decision-making power. Everything is always done by a group. And the reason that I didn't know every coordinator that is reelected every year is because usually that is all done what's called in gross. That the committee will say, the committee moves recommendations 1 through the end in gross. Oh no, remove the budget. That has to go through the AC. And then everything gets done with no debate. But this year, there actually was a debate over the Mission to North America coordinator, Teaching Elder Irwin Ince. And, well, according to Pastor Wilson, the moderator acted improperly. So before we get to what he says, I just brought a few resources for understanding how debate works. Because when we show up, we don't know exactly how to put this. If you grew up Baptist like I did, the meetings did not have much structure, right? The pastor was kind of in charge. People would make motions, but it was like, I knew that you had to move and get a second and stuff like that. But we actually run our meetings according to Robert's Rules of Order. And this is the most recent edition of that work. And the reason we use Robert's Rules of Order is because there have to be structures and guidelines for how debate works. You can't just sort of have people standing up and speaking without parameters and rules. And I've often compared it to like Nate does jujitsu. He's, well, what are you, Nate? Now a purple belt, is that?
That's right. Yeah.
Is that where you're at?
I thought it was a pink belt.
If you wash that purple belt with a little bit of bleach, it will turn pink.
In jujitsu, you're not allowed to hit somebody, right?
You're not allowed to strike people with your knees, your feet, your elbows, your forehead. I mean, if you throw them, basically judo and jiu-jitsu are roughly the same art. They're just different sports, right? So if you throw somebody with a pretty good judo throw, it has the equivalent of hitting them with your entire body, but you're not allowed to technically strike people. That's correct.
Yeah. There are rules that govern the engagement within jiu-jitsu. That's what this is. These are rules that govern how the interaction is supposed to go. And Robert's Rules of Order, in discussing decorum, says, this is section 43, paragraph 21, when a question is pending, a member can condemn the nature or likely consequences of the proposed measure in strong terms, but he must avoid personalities, and under no circumstances can he attack or question the motives of another member. That is a hard and fast rule that you cannot do. You can speak to the motion, but you cannot speak to members' motives, even if, as in this case, the motion was the election of Teaching Elder Ince to the coordinator position. Same thing in Parliamentary Procedure for Presbyters, a Beginner's Guide by Jacob Gerber. He has guidelines for decorum in debate, and the second one is we should refrain from attacking a member's motives. Robert's Rules for Dummies. Yes, I do actually own it, for those of you that heard that question on the floor of the assembly. In discussing decorum, it says focus on issues, not personalities. You don't want somebody across the aisle saying to you, I don't see how that idiot who just spoke can even hold a job with as much sense as he has about spending money. It's much better to just stick to the issues. You may disagree with the point, but you won't feel personally attacked if your opponent simply says, if we make this purchase at this time, we'll have less money in the treasury than I think we need to maintain. Right? So both speeches made the same point, but one engaged in personalities and one did not. Now, in the debate over whether we would reelect Teaching Elder Ince, there were many people who spoke against his job performance. In fact, one of them is on this call. But Ryan, when you spoke against the reelection of Teaching Elder Ince, were you speaking against the person or against the job performance?
Well, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I have every interaction I've had with Irwin Ince has been delightful, personally. I think he is a dear Christian brother and great preacher, speaker. It was very uncomfortable for me to make that speech because it was about job performance. And, we have these goals and we're not meeting our goals. In fact, the issue that I brought up was church plants, that we have fewer church plants now than we did in 2020. And we're supposed to have 3,000 churches by 2033. We've set that goal. Nobody imposed that goal on us. Well, we're not going to meet that goal unless many more miracles happen than ordinarily have been happening with conversions and churches planted. So yeah, I was speaking about job performance.
Yeah, which is allowable under Robert's Rules of Order. Nate, you look like you were wanting to say something.
I think really the bottom line is that this is a discussion about the DeYoung demeanor versus the Moscow mood. That was what the episode of CrossPolitic was really about. I thought, if I can just say, I thought Doug Wilson was the least valuable contributor to that episode. I thought Gabe and Chocolate Knox, I think his real name is Greg. So I thought Gabe and Greg both had valuable things to say. I think one of the problems with Robert's Rules for Order is that they were made for a different time. I told this to Derek Bright, who you both know. I said this to him probably a year ago. I said, Robert's Rules of Order were developed a generation after the last public duel occurred. The last legal public duel. It was created because, once you can no longer ask a fellow gentleman to step outside so you can deal with your problems there, because that's where ultimately things devolve when things get out of hand. Right? You have to come up with some way to deal with things, or you have to come up with a way to prevent the necessity for two guys to step out in the back alleyway, right? these are developed at a time where there was a more widespread cultural sense of honor and sense of being a gentleman, a sense of dignity. And the reality is we just live in a very different era where people have a very different mindset and approach to handling business. I mean, we had, not to name names, I don't know the guy's name, so I can't, but I mean, we had a guy basically in hiking shoes, cargo shorts, a t-shirt, and a backwards hat with the biggest QR code I've ever seen on it, come to the mic and basically, I don't know what that was. It wasn't a speech. You know what I mean? Like this is just in general how we've begun to treat the highest court of what one OPC minister, as we all heard, said is the premier Presbyterian denomination in the United States. Well, in all of North America, really, because we cover Canada. So I think one of the problems that we're facing right now is, Robert's rules are just out of there. I'm not saying they're out of date. I'm not saying anything. Maybe a better way to say it is Robert's rules, kind of like a lightsaber, to quote Obi-Wan. It's a more elegant weapon for a more civilized time. And we're just not living in those days anymore. And that's one of the tensions that we're feeling over this, because as I've said to you guys in text, which is the only reason I'm really here, is on one hand, I understand the position that DeYoung, who is the forebearer of the DeYoung Demeanor, I understand the situation that he was in, and yet Timothy Brindle, if you've seen his hour-long interview with Matthew Everhard on his podcast, Brindle had some really important things to address, and really what he ran into was not the buzzsaw of niceness or the buzzsaw of Kevin DeYoung playing, some sort of politics. No, it was really, we have Robert's rules, and Timothy also did not get to his point in the most efficient way possible. I think what Timothy should have done is he should have just said, this is about effectiveness at church planning because personnel is part of policy, and I'm not sure that him leading the personnel of M&A is the best polity. And then he could have just read a couple of the quotes that he had in his notes that he was prepared to read before he got cut off. So all of that to say, I think Kevin DeYoung did the right thing, and yet it was also, for the discussion, in some sense, it was the wrong thing. Because we needed to hear what Timothy was getting to eventually, and he never got a chance to say it. Because it actually did pertain, and I could see an argument that everything that he was saying, it wasn't personal per se, it was pertaining to the decision about whether or not to retain this person. And I think the question that has to be, I think a question that probably first-time commissioners and onlookers would say is, hey, if that's not the time in place for Timothy Brindle to bring up that issue, when and where and how should he do it? And you guys, this is where you guys know more than I do. Timothy seems to have some real concerns about the personal beliefs or positions held by Dr. Ince. And so where and how should he bring those up, if not on the floor when we're discussing whether or not to rehire Dr.
Yeah, so I actually think I can point to the exact moment where he veered into the moderator needs to step in and get this speech under control. I don't think that Brindle got over the line. I think that DeYoung was being a good moderator by keeping him away from the line.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
See, that's where,
but
if that's your position, I disagree with that. I actually think that I don't think it's a referee's job to tell me when my foot is getting close to out of bounds. He blows the whistle when I go out of bounds. That's just my opinion. So I understand that DeYoung probably felt like that's his role as the moderator. And again, I'm not qualified enough to say that he made a mistake. But if that's the analogy you're using, Jonathan, then I would just have to say I would never want to go back to jiu-jitsu. I would never want a referee to stop me in the middle of the match and say, you are bordering on an illegal technique. I want him to wait until I've actually committed an infraction before he stops the match and resets me and my opponent. Does that make sense? Because that can actually alter the outcome of the match. And I think that's in some sense the kerfuffle with Dr. DeYoung and Brindle. And by the way, I envy neither one of those brothers in all of that. I don't envy Dr. Ince. I don't envy the position Dr. DeYoung was in. And I certainly don't envy Brindle, who had the momentum of his speech kind of stalled out in the middle of his thought. Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
Well, so I think with moderating especially, and granted, I say this as somebody who has not moderated anything larger than a session or a committee meeting. But if a speech is causing a disturbance, whether the person has crossed the line into intemperate language or not, the disturbance is something that you have to address. So well, I don't know that there's an exact analogy to jiu-jitsu, but that's what DeYoung was addressing. Go ahead, Ryan.
And to Mr. Xanders' point, that's the heckler's veto.
Yeah.
I don't think Mr. Brindle crossed a line. I think what he said was perceived by many to have crossed that line. I have here, Brindle suggested that the coordinator might believe he's not safe based on speeches, and I guess he was going to prepare to quote, but at that point there was booing, there was hissing, there was all sorts of things. So I think in a split second, the moderator has to make a decision, and he's hearing point of order, and I suspect, and this is going to motives, and so if we were debating according to Robert's Rules of Order, this would be out of order. But I think that what Moderator DeYoung was trying to do was to save Mr. Brindle from having a point of order made against him, and then to save from having to rule on that point of order. Because in my opinion, he didn't breach decorum. He may have come close, but as Nate said, he didn't cross the line. You know, I would be really upset if I'm driving 33 miles an hour in a 35 mile an hour zone and a policeman pulls me over and says, "Well, you weren't doing anything wrong, but you were
looked like you were accelerating
to being 35 miles." Yeah, you look like you were going up there. And I said, well, look, what's your probable cause? You have no reason to stop me, right? You violated my civil rights. You stopped me without probable cause. Well, I think the moderator, because even the moderator said, I would ask you to do so in a more temperate way. Yeah. So Kevin DeYoung acknowledged he was speaking in a temperate way. Yeah. But he was speaking about a view, and so the way Mr. Brindle did so was to paraphrase the view and then draw an inference from the view of the coordinator, which set some people off. And it is increasingly common, I've seen in our assemblies, where the heckler's veto will either win out or stifle discussion.
Which, isn't it interesting? They're actually violating order with their booing and hissing while calling for a point of order that doesn't need to be called yet. And I think this is my frustration. I'm not saying it's intentional, or I'm not saying that they're purposefully not using equal weights and measures, but it seems like they know the rules when it works for them. Because Irwin Ince gets retained, and all of a sudden they're cheering and clapping. And you're telling me that they knew that it was time to point of order while Timothy Brindle was talking, but they didn't know that you can't be booing and hissing while someone's saying something you don't like, and they didn't know that you're not allowed to clap and cheer after a vote goes a certain way. I'm sorry. I can't believe that many guys...
Well, we don't know that...
don't know. You know what I mean? Maybe most of them don't, but it seems like...
Well, the assembly knew that you weren't supposed to clap. I am with you on that, because on Tuesday night, there was a debate over reporting ethnic data, and a gentleman from Calvary Presbytery, who is himself African American, made a speech against collecting ethnic data. And he said, when my church reports the communicant membership, I am counted. My identity is in Christ. And that is, I forget the exact wording that he used, but that was the point that he was making, was that I don't need to be reported as African American. I can be reported as a Christian. And several people, myself included, clapped. I shouldn't have done that. And when the moderator chastised the assembly for doing that, I refrained in the future, because I was like, he's right. You're not supposed to clap. You're supposed to simply let debate happen. So the assembly definitely knew that you weren't supposed to clap.
That's a good reminder, Jonathan. That's true.
He did, yeah. He did inform the assembly once again that you're not supposed to clap. So these guys are going through the several speeches, and I just think their analysis of the parliamentary procedure, if you don't know how it is supposed to work, is flawed. Sorry, it is flawed, and it's especially dangerous for those who don't know how parliamentary procedure is supposed to work. So I think this is at the part where DeYoung is about to set the rules for the debate. But
yeah, and
sorry, you're going to say something, Nate?
I think part of the problem is guys like Doug Wilson and the guys he's sitting there with on CrossPolitic, they're used to actually debating. What we do on the floor of General Assembly and at Presbytery is more like discussion. Like it's really, and I'm using that term to kind of help the layman kind of, because if you're a layman and you're watching General Assembly, you're going, this doesn't sound like debate. This sounds like a discussion back and forth, which is, I think, maybe a helpful way to phrase it so that we can understand why it's so much more rigid than 99% of the debates that we've ever watched. Sorry. Roll that beautiful bean footage, Jonathan.
Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you. This item is before the body. This is unusual, but we will follow the normal rules of debate, which is a 10-minute topic clock, 3-minute clock. We will try to move back and forth as best I can, for or against. To remind you that we want to speak with proper decorum befitting this assembly. We know that this is a matter that deals with a particular coordinator appointment, but I think we can find ways to speak to this that are not personality driven, though in speaking for or against, you may speak to things that you believe lend support or not to this particular recommendation. If it is my judgment that any particular speech is out of hand, I will rule it so, and will trust you, brothers, to proceed with the proper Christian decorum as we look at this matter. I believe that microphone number 2.
Okay, so Ryan, I think I can translate what the moderator said as be nice. Is that more or less what he's saying?
Yeah, be nice, be respectful, be clear.
Yes. And if you're going to speak against having Teaching Elder Ince as the coordinator for the next year, don't make it about him personally, but about why you don't think he is the best person for the job. And he's acknowledging that that's a really fine line, because Irwin Ince is a person. And like,
yeah, I remember in college I was on the student government, and we impeached somebody and we found him guilty. And I was vice president of something or another, and I had to go deliver the verdict to the man. And I told him, it's not personal, it's procedural. And I told my dad about that. He said, Ryan, never tell somebody it's not personal, because it's always personal. And I remembered that for, 20-something years now.
That's such a good,
and this, how do you,
good point.
Yeah, well, let me ask you guys this.
Performance.
Yeah, like, I think that Nate already kind of spoke to this, but like, did you guys feel bad for Dr. Ince? I did. Like, his job is being evaluated in front of 2,200 people.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
yeah,
I didn't.
And there was.
This is. Okay. Did he? I mean, look, I didn't feel bad for him not because I don't like him. I don't know the man. What I said to somebody next to me is, I said, "Hey, you got to hand it to him. He never skips chest and shoulder day. I mean, he looks great, man. Looks fit for a guy his age. I'm sure he and I would love to hang out. We'd have a lot to talk about. But this is the job, right? Let's just think about this for a second. We were debating whether or not to pay him $270,000 or to pay him over $300,000. I'm sorry, but I don't feel bad for anybody that's going to be making $270,000 after a 10% pay cut. Like, even if that pay cut passes. But you know what I'm saying? Like, at some point, we have to say, hey, this is a little awkward. Like, I wouldn't want to be in his shoes, but, he's going to put his head on a very different pillow than I am tonight. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. Maybe I'm getting a little bit off on a rabbit trail, but there's something to be said for that, Everybody that stands for these kinds of jobs, they're made of different stuff. They have to be in order to do these coordinator jobs, in order to be stated clerk of the PCA, to be moderator of the PCA. It's not like we just snatch some random guy out of the crowd. We're like, all right, come on up here. We're going to have this conversation. This is, I guess what I'm trying to say is, I don't know the man personally, but everything I've heard about him, he's made of a different kind of stuff than the average guy. He's highly capable. I really think that it seemed like, just from the way he conducted himself, it seems like some of his friends were more concerned than he was. Like, it seems like, some brothers in the audience were more nervous or anxious than he was. You know what I mean? And so, I thought if I can compliment him again, I thought the way he comported himself was really impressive. But no, we should never feel bad for a guy who's, who willingly stands for a very difficult job, and this is part of it, in my opinion.
well, I did feel bad for him, and I showed up at the assembly thinking that I was going to end up voting to go ahead and have him still be M&A coordinator. I was actually persuaded by the debate against having him be the M&A coordinator, and it was like a painful vote because I didn't want to do it, because I have this very human desire to not be mean. And it just seemed like, hey, not only are we going to have you not do the job that you asked to be able to do, but we're going to do it in front of 2,000 people and say, no, you're not reelected. Like, I did feel bad for the guy. And like the debate itself was just awkward, just in every way.
It was awkward. And
I agree.
this is why we don't debate nominations for permanent committee slots. That last year when the election for state clerk was pulled out of omnibus, we had a 5-minute, maybe it's 3 minutes, maybe it's 90 seconds. It seemed like 5 minutes from Dr. David Coffin explaining the rules of debate when you're voting on a person for a position, how to do that. And we didn't have that this year. And, I don't know that we needed a refresher, but it is hard. And this is part of being a man, isn't it, Nate, that you have to be able to have these discussions as men.
That's right.
And I think that in this discussion, Irwin acquitted himself as a man.
That's right.
As a godly man.
100%.
He stood there, he took it, he didn't lash out.
That's right.
There's much that we can all learn from the way he endured this.
If I thought that Irwin was, because sometimes, look, guys who don't have the fortitude for a certain task, they get thrown into it. And if I thought that Irwin was one of those guys that got kind of shoved ahead, or encouraged to step into a role that he didn't really want, then I would feel bad. But I actually think that the way that he conducted himself during this discussion should give us, even though I think all three of us voted against retaining him, to me, because of the way he conducted himself, it actually gave me more confidence in him moving forward. So that's, and I really wish, I actually don't know if we could have called for executive session for this kind of discussion. Maybe we could have, and if that would have been allowable, maybe that would have been good, because the reality is there was a lot of people in that room at every moment, basically, that was not a voting commissioner, and maybe some of the awkwardness and maybe some of the difficulty of this scenario could have been alleviated had it just been voting commissioners in the room. That's just a thought.
Yeah, we'll have to ask the mod father if a motion to enter executive session is in order at the assembly.
Well, I don't know. There were 1,948 votes on that question. So I don't know, what's the difference between 2,000 people in the room versus 3,500? I don't know. 1,500
people that don't
that
don't need to have a front row seat to this, maybe. Seems like a pretty good number to me.
That's true.
But let's keep going with the CrossPolitic, guys.
I just want to point out, it's not personality driven. Right. For or against, you can speak. Right.
But there's going to be things to speak about.
Right. And who put this stuff in my
Sports Live. It's our staff. Now you really can't
sabotage.
Get it
out. But he is going to be the person who decides.
Right. What's proper Christian decorum.
Right. At the end of the day.
All right.
That's really important.
So we got a couple examples of what of those testifying for and against.
Okay.
So here's these are not in orders and no.
Although I will say this next clip is Sean.
Yeah, Sean Lucas.
Sean
Lucas,
Lucas,
we had on the show before.
who was like the second up to speak.
Okay.
So go ahead, roll.
I rise as someone whose church is very invested in the work of MNA. Not only do we support the work of MNA in our missions budget, but we also support a number of individual church planters. We were one of the founders of the Mid-South Church Planting Network. I chaired that network for a number of years, and we have been active in seeking to raise up church planters through our own foundation financially, as well as creating a pipeline of future church planters. I can say without equivocation that Irwin Ince's leadership has been instrumental to what we have done in
Good
my
character.
congregation. Fathers and brothers, I would urge us to approve once again Teaching Elder Ince as our coordinator for MNA, because he is a transformational leader. He has turned the focus of MNA back towards church planting, not simply handing it off to regional church planting networks, but coming alongside himself.
Okay.
No, hold on.
Staff to resource these church planting networks and churches that are passionate about church planting so that we might carry out the good work that God is.
So his character affects the institution. Got it.
That work would not have happened without Irwin's leadership. He is a transformational leader for this time. He is also, as we know, a humble preacher and a hope-filled pastor. Even just in our meeting today, we have seen his humility and his apology and his willingness to recognize where M&A made mistakes, but he is also led with hope in a denomination that at times might create challenges for some. He's gone to each part of our denomination, all the way to Canada even, to bring the good news of God's mission to bear for the work of the Presbyterian Church, not just in the United States, but in America.
I think that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Now let's go into.
So the case that they make with that speech, and we're not going to watch every speech that they review, but the case that they make with that speech is that Dr. Sean Lucas said a lot of nice things about Dr. Irwin Ince, and so personalities were on the table. I don't think that that is the correct way of viewing that. I think that Dr. Lucas and Dr. Ince are obviously friends, and that Dr. Lucas was sticking up for his buddy. But, and you guys can tell me if I'm wrong here, what I heard was he's an effective leader. He is making sure that churches get planted, which I know, Ryan, you disputed, but that's the case that Dr. Lucas is making, and that he is a good preacher and a good pastor, and this is why we should hire that guy. Am I wrong there? That none of that is.
That was all job related.
First of all, the rules are you can't attack someone's personality, but it's all performance-based stuff that Dr. Lucas is listing there.
That's right.
Am I missing something?
No.
I think it was interspersed with, we like him, he's a great guy, he's a visionary leader. It was instrumental. Okay. But yeah, I think you did make a good point that there were some job performance issues attested to and endorsed there. And, yes, there are fewer church plants now. I don't remember whether he spoke before or after me, but he could have made a point that, well, the reason for, and somebody made this on social media, well, the reason there are fewer church plants now than in 2020 is this little thing called COVID. And maybe that was would have been an effective rebuttal for the point that I made. We have more church plants now than we do in 2023 or something like that. I don't know. Yeah, I think you make some points there that he does address job performance issues, and this is why we should rehire him. And I don't know what was said in the Committee of Commissioners. I don't know precisely what was said in the M&A Permanent Committee discussion, but I think that everybody on both sides of the PCA in those meetings has acknowledged there are significant performance deficits.
That's right. All three votes were very close.
And is this to be? Yes. And so is this an issue where we need a performance improvement plan, or is this an issue where we need to go in a different direction? And that was the discussion that we were having on the floor and in those two committees separately.
Yes. What did not happen, and I know you brothers have been with me for a while, so I'm going to telescope a lot of the plans that I had for playing stuff. But what Pastor Wilson says is that the PCA has an idol, and that idol is racial reconciliation, and that Brindle went up against the PCA idol, and that's why he was, because all of these other people spoke to personality stuff, but when Brindle went against the PCA idol, that's why he was struck down. I do not believe that is what happened.
I'm in agreement with you.
I believe that the moderator was trying to maintain order.
Yeah, so I've watched that CrossPolitic episode twice now. I can't believe I've watched it twice. But the second time I watched it, I took notes.
I can't believe that.
Yeah. And so let me, I thought I appreciated the discussion for most of the part. I think I'm thankful for Reformed adjacent denominations that are outside of NAPARC because, honestly, as we all know, with the proliferation and weaponization of the 31-2 in our BCO, it's kind of nice to have people that can have difficult conversations about what's going on in the PCA that are kind of untouchable by our polity. But having said that, there was 5 or 6 things that Doug said throughout the episode that I thought just weren't helpful or were off base. First one, I think at 24 minutes in, he does describe racial reconciliation as the golden calf or the idol of the PCA. And he makes the point that Brindle didn't get personal with Irwin, he got personal with the PCA, and that's why people were upset. I think on one hand, I understand Doug's point because one of the things that I thought when someone was defending Irwin is, look, Irwin's already apologized for this. So, like, why do we need to do anything else? And I thought immediately in my brain, we've apologized for racism like 6 times in the last 40 years. So I understand where Doug Wilson's coming from, because it seems like we keep not being able to get past this. It's like no amount of apologizing is enough. But at the same time, I think that represents a small section of the PCA. It doesn't represent all of the PCA. And so I don't think it's fair to say the PCA has a golden calf. I think a handful of it would have been better for Doug to say maybe a handful of guys in the PCA that have the levers of power and influence in front of them are still wrestling with this. I'm not saying I would agree with that. I'm just saying that kind of assessment by Doug maybe would have been a little bit more accurate. At 2630 in the CrossPolitic episode, Doug made the classic mistake of saying that there's theological liberals in the PCA. We don't have any theological liberals. Even Presbycast has said this a dozen times in their episodes in the last year. We have theological progressives, maybe. Maybe you could say we have some social liberals, but when it comes to theology, we don't have any liberals. At 2845, he says, maybe Irwin Ince can't manage M&A, but he can manage the PCA. Right. And I just thought to myself, really, Doug, did you see the margins in all 3 votes of the permanent committee, of the committee of commissioners, and in the assembly? That doesn't look like Irwin is able to, quote, manage us. I think it's a weird thing to say about Irwin. And I also think it's a weird thing to say based on the actual numbers. And at 30 minutes in, Doug gives a really bad analogy of the PCA. He describes the PCA as the dad, and Irwin Ince is like the daughter who's overspending, and the dad can't get the daughter under control. And I just thought, well, that's a weird analogy, because if you're going to use that kind of a father-daughter, daughter-out-of-control analogy, it's more like Irwin Ince is the dad of M&A. And, M&A is spending more than they're bringing in, and he can't seem to rein her in. So I'm not saying this is what happened. I'm just saying his analogy was off base, because it was more akin, to use Doug's bad analogy, it was more akin to 2,000 dads voting, and we were voting on whether or not one dad is doing well in his household. As much of a wordsmith as Doug Wilson is, if we say nothing else about the man, certainly he's a wordsmith. That was just a bad analogy. It was a swing and a miss from Doug Wilson in terms of illustrations and analogies. And then finally, at 3740, Doug Wilson basically calls Irwin Ince a DEI hire. Let me tell you, if Irwin Ince was white, he would still have kept his job. It's not a white or black thing. The PCA has, as we've already discovered through some of our comments here, the PCA has an 11th commandment: you must be nice. And it feels, and Jonathan, I think you could testify to this, it feels awkward and icky to be talking about firing a guy or reducing his salary in front of 3,500 people. Right, and it does feel awkward. But to me, to say that, to label a man as a D, there's really nothing more, I think, disrespectful that you could do to a man who's black or brown, or any dude that's not white, basically, than to say he was a DEI hire, because you're just immediately casting aside all of his credibility, because you're saying he only got the job because of the color of his skin. Well, Irwin, even if we might disagree with them on stuff, his credentials go far beyond just the amount of melanin in his skin. I don't know. I just thought, I've already said this, but I thought Doug had the least to contribute of note to that episode, whereas I thought Chocolate Knox and Gabe Wrench had far more maybe helpful things to discuss regarding this issue at General Assembly. But I just wanted to get all that out there. While I'm appreciative, if there's a sliding scale between the young demeanor and the Moscow mood, I'm somewhere in the middle, probably more towards the Moscow mood. But this is just one instance of the Moscow mood swinging and missing, I think, in terms of evaluating what's going on in our house over here in the PCA.
Yeah, well, and full disclosure for me, Kevin DeYoung was my systematics professor in seminary. And so while he certainly has no idea who I am and does not remember me at all, I did learn a lot from that man. And actually, like, my love of the spirituality of the church comes from Kevin DeYoung. And so I may react in ways that are like defensive of my guy kind of thing. And right. I'm aware of that. But I do not think that it is accurate to say that DeYoung was fearful of the PCA idol of racial reconciliation, and so he jumped in at that point. As we've all said, there was a major disturbance in that room when that happened, and it's the moderator's job to get control of that.
That's right.
Also, when you impute when you impute motives, which he came very, very close to do, that is breaking the rules, and then specifically mentioning the sin of partiality, we actually have rules regarding that. Like, you can't just accuse someone of a sin. There is this thing called due process. And I do think that, again, if he was accusing Dr. Ince of partiality on the floor, then that would be breaking the rules. And at the very least, he came very close to it. I don't know, Ryan, what do you have to say to those random thoughts of mine?
Well, he started to talk about his views on affinity groups, and some have said this is partiality. And I've had people on the podcast that I host that believe it's sin. I'm not certain that I would go that far. Or I'm certain I wouldn't go that far. I think it's just a difference of opinion on how to interpret theology, and that's where I like to leave it. But I hadn't thought about how he prefaced the speech with the issue of the sin of partiality. Is it partiality? Or is it just a failure to reckon with how pervasive the gospel's influence is? As I've been preaching through Ephesians 2 and 3, that's one of the things that has struck me with how much celebration the Apostle Paul does of the reverse of Babel that he's seeing in the church, with Jews and Gentiles coming together to be that one temple without distinction. And I think we diminish the glory of Christ when we highlight these differences. Now, you can take that and you can run with it, and you can say, well, that see, you've said it's sin. I'm not saying that there's and the issue of concupiscence here could come in, I guess, but I'm not prepared to say that these guys are sinning by what they are doing. And I think maybe it was Nate that maybe if he had started with the quotes that he was prepared to share, or the inferences that he was drawing from the writings and speaking and policies of M&A, that may have not created the disturbance. But I don't think we can hold a speaker accountable for what other people do for about his words unless he's telling them to do something. Right? We've seen it time and again throughout history, and with YouTube videos, there'll be pro-life people reading Bible verses, and the police will come in and tell them they have to stop because the counter-protesters are getting disorderly. Well, you can't shut someone down simply because a bad actor is reacting in a bad way to someone's speech. Now, I'm not saying anyone at General Assembly was a bad actor, but what I am saying is you can't shut down a speaker. You ought not shut down a speaker because of the way people are reacting to it. However, when you're the moderator of a room full of 148 voting commissioners, you've got to do something. One of the things that we don't remember, or we often don't realize, is that a moderator of General Assembly has 3 people talking to him at all times. The speaker, and then at least 2 of the parliamentarians. And so I think what Moderator DeYoung did there was try to, okay, here's the issue. I'm going to try to address it. And as somebody has pointed out, he could have, Mr. Brindle could have asked for his 7 seconds back. Yeah. And that may have changed the conversation if he had done that. But I think Mr. Brindle was being gracious and, okay, I'm just going to go sit down, and I've already spoken for 60 or 58 seconds. Okay.
Yeah, just imagine I would to compare all that, when my wife and I are having a conversation and my 3 sons start to talk to us, the amount of chaos that floods my brain as that's happening. Just imagine doing that in front of 2,000 people. And again, if you think that Kevin DeYoung, who, like I said, that DeYoung demeanor, Moscow mood spectrum, I'm kind of in the middle and maybe lean a little bit more towards the mood. But if you think that Kevin DeYoung is like obsessed with the liberal or the progressive gaze, man, to me, I just can't imagine that. Kevin DeYoung,
that's moronic.
Yeah, well, maybe so. But his whole life, you just look at the man's career, his whole life, he's just been, my mother, through her father's Dutch, and so there's a lot of Kevin DeYoung's mannerisms and demeanor that's very familiar to me. My grandfather was incredibly amiable and easy to get along with. Kevin's he's that kind of down the middle, amiable guy. It's why a guy like him can be elected moderator, and everybody in the PCA goes, "Yep, this is going to be good for us. This is going to be good for Assembly because of Kevin's demeanor, And so I don't know the man personally, but I think by observing him over the last 20 years in the Reformed faith, I don't think he's changed. I don't think he's been altered by fame or success. I don't think he really. I also don't see him as very much of a partisan guy. He just always seems to be just He's always had this very wide and ever increasing, influence. I mean, there's a reason. I mean, Doug even said in that episode that he and Nancy have been going through his kind of Kevin DeYoung's daily devotional systematic theology. I mean, this is a guy with a widespread influence, and it's just the way he's always been. So it's, I've never once thought, yeah, Kevin DeYoung has, he's got a particular axe to grind, or he doesn't strike me as having any enemies, so to speak, so. Good for Kevin that's what poise is, right? Poise is being yourself under all circumstances. Poise is being your true self no matter what's going on around you. And the Kevin DeYoung that we got at General Assembly is just the Kevin DeYoung that we've gotten for 20 years in the Reformed world. So good for him.
Yeah. And I think it's important to remember the moderator has two jobs: ensure that order is kept and ensure that all sides get the chance to speak. And Ryan, I was actually about to ask you how much time was left on the clock when DeYoung stepped up to the mic. It was 7 seconds, and Brindle could have asked for that time back, but he didn't. The vote happened. The vote went the way it went, and now this is how things are. And I don't think anybody was mistreated. I don't think any side had an unfair advantage. I think that there was a very robust and vigorous debate, which is very odd when you're debating a person. And the moderator was rightly concerned that be kept within the bounds. Now, the other thing that Wilson said was an idol was he said those in the PCA that don't have racial reconciliation as their idol have peace in the church as their idol. And I'm sorry, Pastor Wilson, I don't know you personally. I actually don't pay attention to much of what you say. But peace in the church is not an idol. As evidence for that, I will submit to you Ephesians 4. That we are supposed to strive for the unity of, unity of the Spirit and the bonds of peace. That's the wording that the apostle uses. Because we have one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. And so even though the three of us voted against Irwin Ince to be M&A coordinator, he is still the M&A coordinator of my church. And I love my church. I may not always agree with what she does. I actually lost a couple of votes. But that's my church, and I don't think that it's an idol to desire the peace and purity of the church.
Yeah, I think not to disagree with you at all, Jonathan, I think what he was referencing is probably peace faking. There's peacemaking, there's war making, and there's peace faking, right? To kind of quote Ken Sande's little pamphlet. And so that's probably what he was referring to, is a fake sense, a false peace, and I've experienced that in the PCA where guys are just like, hey, let's just, everybody just, let's everybody just calm down and get along. And that's not true peace, right? But I can't say that's a widespread problem in the PCA from what I've observed. I'd have to think about that more.
Well, not far be it from me to defend Doug Wilson, but I think we do have a problem in the PCA with niceness, and that we have a faulty understanding of what niceness is and what peace requires, that some of the things that people understand to be not nice, it's not that they're not nice, they're just hard to say and hard to hear, but need to be said. And I think we all have that problem. And Nate, maybe it comes down to manliness or lack thereof, that we need to be able to have these hard conversations. And this was a hard conversation to have on the floor, and we had it. And hopefully we won't have to have that conversation next year. But for 2 or 3 years now, we've been sort of approaching having to have that conversation about one of our very well-paid coordinators. And that, Nate, I think you brought that up, that's part of this discussion, that these men are paid very well, and I don't fault them for that. Some people have accused me, well, if you don't want to make so much money, you should. My problem is not with how much the coordinators are compensated. Is that if you are compensated at this level, I don't want you to be in the news at all.
That's right.
Unless it's positive. I mean, look, how often is Tim Townsend in the news? Who even knows who Tim Townsend is?
Sure.
He is our PCA Foundation president, and he's never in the news except that, he has found this donor who's going to give this bequest that's going to bail out the administrative committee of the hole they're in after the St. Louis Assembly, or whatever it was.
Yeah.
That if you're compensated at a certain level, there should not be these kinds of snafus.
That's right. I can remember working for not for a nonprofit, but I worked with a nonprofit before going into ministry. And somebody that I was working with was upset how much the president of the nonprofit made. They made about $400,000. And I said to them, well, how much should the leader of an organization that takes in $1 billion a year, how much should they make? And she didn't have an answer, because I don't think anybody had ever put it to her that way. She was just like, I just don't think somebody leading a nonprofit should make $400,000 a year. And I said, well, their annual budget is like maybe 10 million shy of $1 billion. It's a lot of money. Like you can't just go to like Indeed.com or ZipRecruiter and find somebody qualified to like lead this big of an organization. So I think you're right. I think when it comes to these various coordinators, it's a really tough job. And as we just saw, I mean, especially when you could potentially be let go every year, you've got to get rehired. That's another wrinkle, another layer of another degree of difficulty to the job. And so, they should be well compensated and be men of quality and skill.
And I think that was a factor. There were at least 2, I think, questions about, well, what happens if we vote this in the negative? Does he lose his job? Which that's hard.
Yeah.
And I think there were guys who didn't want to have to make that decision.
Yeah, that's right. Well, and also some people catastrophize. They think to themselves, well, what's he going to do for work if he doesn't do this? And the answer is, well, he's a really gifted preacher. He would get hired somewhere. Anyway, that's a whole nother rabbit trail. But every one of these guys that's skilled enough to be a coordinator could find other work. Yeah, that's right, probably.
Yeah. But I think overall, this episode that happened on the floor of the assembly is a lot more complicated than what the CrossPolitic guys portrayed this as, because they portrayed it as everybody could say all the personal things they wanted until this guy came along and he attacked the PCA idol. And that's really just not the case. We have rules governing our procedure in debate. We have a moderator who is trying to do his job. We have this really awkward situation where we're debating somebody's job, and while I ended up voting against him, it was not lost on me how awkward that was. And now that that's all over, we got to all still be in the same church. And so I guess I'll just close the episode with the words of Paul from Ephesians chapter 4. And it is my prayer that God would guide the PCA to live out what the apostle wrote here. It says, I therefore, a prisoner of the Lord, urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope that belongs to your call, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. But grace was given to each one of us according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it says, when he ascended on high, he led a host of captives, and he gave gifts to men. In saying he ascended, what does it mean but that he also descended into the lower regions of the earth? He who descended is the one who also ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. And he gave the apostles, the prophets, the evangelists, the shepherds and teachers, to equip the saints for the work of ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until we attain the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to mature manhood, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, so that we may no longer be children tossed to and fro by the waves and carried about by every wind of doctrine, by human cunning, by craftiness and deceitful schemes. Rather, speaking the truth in love, we are to grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and held together by every joint with which it is equipped, when each part is working properly, makes the body grow so that it builds itself up in love. That is what God has been doing for the Presbyterian Church in America since our founding, and we pray that he would continue to do so. So, Ryan, Nate, thank you guys for coming on, and I realize that you have given me way more of your time than your wives probably agreed to up front, so I appreciate you guys, and let us know in the comments if you think, one of us is completely off base. Let me know. I'm always happy to interact with people as long as you keep the comments respectful and considerate of other people. Treat it like it's the PCA General Assembly. And if you can do that, I'd love to hear from you. We'll see you next time.